Hey there, Pearlside small group leaders. Thank you for joining us for another Small Group Leaders podcast where we help you prepare to lead your small group. It's Pastor Billy here with Lex and Lomibao, downtown Okahala congregation.
Yeah, that's right.
Leader. And we are excited to be diving into part 2 of RelationSHIFT. A little change can make a big difference. And, you know, one of the reasons why we're in this series is, you know, Jesus commands us to love one another. And in fact, he said it's one of the greatest ways we preach the gospel, actually. We're not just called to preach the gospel with our words, but through our relationships. He said, love one another so that the world will know you are my disciples.
That's right.
And so if we don't learn how to love one another, we don't learn to conduct our relationships in a way that honors God. We can say all the right things about God, but they're going to look at our relationships and they're going to see some dissonance there. It's not going to make sense. And so we as Christians need to get better at living with healthy relationships, because as we do, it proclaims the gospel. And so that's why this series is so important. You know, all the congregation pastors, we talked this through, and it's just great to see. We want to see our relationships get healthier through it all. And so we've been looking at the story of the life of this man named Joseph. And as we saw last week, he inherited a lot of relational dysfunction from the previous generations. But Joseph was able to break the cycle. And we're trying to learn lessons from his life so that we can break the generational cycles of relational dysfunction and pain in our own lives. And so in this particular passage, we see how jealousy, pride, and the fractured relational dynamics led Joseph's brothers to wanting to murder him, first of all, and then eventually selling him as a slave.
Yep.
And so that's some major relational dysfunction. But there's a few lessons that we see in this. First of all, and we preach this in all our weekend services, is that unprocessed emotions can lead to fractured relationships. If we don't process our emotions well, our relationships can be fractured. We see it in Joseph's brothers.
Yep.
They were jealous of him. They hated him. And they resented him so much that it led to wanting to kill him. Now, that's some deep resentment. I think all of us have had resentment or jealousy in our hearts, but I venture to say very few of us that actually plotted killing someone, I hope, and have never sold anyone into slavery, I hope, right? But that's some deep, unprocessed emotions. And whether it's jealousy, anger, hurt, whatever it is, if we don't process those emotions well, it will lead to negative outcomes and it will destroy our relationships. You know, Joseph, you know, himself, you know, he's not completely innocent in this, that he had a lot of pride in his heart. We see it. You know, he probably enjoyed being the favorite son of his father and being told to go and tattletale on his brothers and all that kind of deal. And so there was some pride in his heart that he didn't process. And that led his brothers to resent him even more. It doesn't justify what they did to him, but he isn't completely scot-free in this, where he didn't process some of those emotions well as well. And those fractured relationships can eventually leave us feeling trapped in pits, right? We see Joseph literally thrown into a pit, and I think that's also metaphorical to the spiritual and emotional, relational pits we can find ourselves in sometimes. And there are going to be a lot of people in our small groups that, as we talked about it in service and in our group, that feel like they're in a relational pit right now. They feel trapped. They feel like they can't get out, that they're lost in broken relationships, broken marriages. It's hopeless. My marriage will never get healed, or my kids will never forgive me, whatever it is. And it feels like you're in a pit. But there's always good news that God always wants to lift us out of pits. That's what he does. Here's the shift. The shift is we need to focus on the Lord, not the pit, not the problem, or the people. And this is so huge, because I think what often happens, I know I see this in my own life, that when I'm in a relational pit, I focus on what they did, what was unfair. I focus on the situation that I'm in now because of what they did, right? And you just focus on all of the stuff. The pivot or the shift is we need to focus on the Lord. And that's what Joseph did. Because in Genesis 39, when we see Joseph now being blessed by God and favored by God in the house of Potiphar, it says 5 times in 4 verses, the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord blessed Joseph. The Lord caused him to prosper. 5 times the Lord is mentioned. And that's a literary device where the attention is now being drawn away from the problem and it's being drawn to the Lord. And I think that's what needs to happen. When we're facing relational difficulties and when we find ourselves in pits, we have to shift our focus onto the Lord. And that's often what we don't do. Like I said, we focus on all the problems. We need to shift our focus to the Lord. So how can we in group encourage one another to fix our focus on God, to shift our focus to God rather than the people, the problem, or the pits that we find ourselves in? And ultimately, Jesus is our example of this. He focused on the Lord. He focused on God's plan and his purpose. And I think the most powerful picture of that is on the cross. When he was being murdered for the sins of humanity, he prayed. And he said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. When he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, contemplating what was about to happen to him, he said, Father, not my will, but yours be done. He didn't focus on what they were saying, what they were doing. He focused on God and God's will. And the Lord elevated him. The Lord caused him to be seated at the right hand of glory. Amen. So I think that there's so many lessons in this for us. But I think a big thing is, how can we help people to focus on the Lord, not the problem, not the pit or the people? And if we can do that, I think that will make a huge difference. So what stands out to you from the main thought, scriptures, and the past weekend sermon? Lexon, want to lead us off?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think what really stood out was, obviously, when it talks about unprocessed emotion can lead to fractured relationships. I think we all can agree that we've all been betrayed, taken advantage of, or maybe sometimes just unjustly compared with other people. Yeah. And personally, in my own life, there was a time where I was doing network marketing, and it became a Ponzi scheme. Now, I want to pause here and say, if you're doing network marketing, not saying yours is a Ponzi scheme, but mine was. But I did it for about 3 years, and I traveled around, made pretty good money. And but after it became a Ponzi scheme, all of the people that were surrounding me ended up disappearing. And it put me in an emotional and spiritual pit where I had to move from Los Angeles to San Diego to try to get a new start. Now, I didn't do a lot of things well after that. I partied, I drank, and I did stuff that you shouldn't do. But there was a specific moment where, even without me being a committed Christian, I made the decision to refocus myself by writing a letter saying, you know what, God, if you're real, I mean, right now, I feel like my brothers don't understand me. I feel like everybody abandoned me. Even my own girlfriend cheated on me and broke up with me. God, I feel completely unloved and alone. But God, please show me that you love me and that you're still with me. And about in a week after that letter was written, that was when an Uber driver picked me up from the club and he shared the gospel with me. And then from those of you that know, 6 months later, after he dropped me off, he sees me at a Starbucks. But for the sake of this, he ended up telling me after he prayed for me, he said, I love you and God loves you. So even in that moment, in pure desperation, I had to refocus myself out of the pit and out of the situation and away from the other people that hurt me. And I had to put my eyes on Jesus. And he showed up when I did that.
I love that, man. So you actually wrote a prayer to God. That's essentially what you did. Yep. You didn't really know him yet. That's beautiful. I think that's it right there. You know, you refocus, because you could have just stayed, because that's what a lot of people do, right? They stay focused on the problem. They just dwell on it over and over and over and over. Years and years and years of resentment build up because you just focus on what they did, right? Anybody that looks like the person that hurt you, it brings back the memory, right? Someone says their name, it brings back the memory. You know what I mean? Like, and it's just, and you just focus on the person, and it doesn't get you better. It gets you more and more bitter. But you chose to focus on the Lord, and the Lord now began to open up his favor in your life by sending that Uber driver and new opportunities. Then you end up in church, and you end up moving to Hawaii, and then you get into ministry, and then you meet your wife, and on and on and on, right? But the pivot was the focus. That's so beautiful, Lexi.
And one thing I want to say too is, even they say in psychology, it's not about what happens to you, but it's about what you think about what happened to you. So changing the perspective, because because of discipleship, now I look at all of those hard seasons that I went through, the betrayals, the abandonment, as preparation for what I'm doing now.
That's so good.
And I feel like there's so many of us that are probably in our own pit. And instead of saying, man, this sucks, we should ask, God, what are you doing? How are you preparing me for the next through this season?
And I'm convinced that's what Joseph did in the pit, because the Lord wouldn't have favored him the way that he did if he'd have gotten more and more bitter, more and more resentful. Somewhere in, whether it was in the pit or the caravan ride to Egypt or maybe in Potiphar's house, he chose to refocus on the Lord, and the Lord began to prosper him. And I think that is the pivot that all of us need to make. Thank you so much for sharing that. You know, we can, and you know, when we ask this question, let's try to get people to see that, you know what I mean, through your own story. So be prepared to share some of your own examples, and tripod, you know, prompt those stories to come up, because like Lexon shared, if people can see that little shift, man, I think a lot of freedom can begin to happen there. But you can also move on to the second question, which says, how have you experienced jealousy, pride, comparison in your relationships? How did it impact you or those around you? You know, in my group this past week, we talked a little bit about the favoritism thing and a little bit of the jealousy thing. And that was really helpful, because a lot of us didn't realize, you know what, I did experience that. And it does bug me to this day, you know. And sometimes it isn't until you start talking about it that you realize, oh, that is in there. That is why I act out in a certain way. I was talking to someone recently, and he said, I never really realized why I get so angry at certain things. I'm doing good, and all of a sudden something happens, and then I flip out. And it was, as he was talking about it, it got more and more clear. So let's encourage people to talk things out, because it's in the talking that a lot of processing and healing can come. And then the third question, Joseph was thrown into a pit. What emotional or spiritual pits have you experienced due to your broken relationships? What happened, and how did you grow from it? So Lexon, you shared your emotional pit.
No,
Anything
absolutely.
else you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I'll even say this, even after that emotional pit, there was more emotional pits that happened. And one specific one is when that Uber driver, he disappeared out of my life, where even to this day, I still do not know where he is. But there was a moment that I had with my dad, who I also forgave, and that fractured relationship was healed. But it was so interesting because I was in my feels, and I'm like, man, how could this guy abandon me? How can he leave me? Man, like, I really have nobody. And my dad said this, Lexan, do you know that maybe it's good to think he did his job and it got you to where you needed to go? And right at that moment, I was like, man, that's so true. So instead of having that bitterness and that resentment towards Brother Will, now I thank him. I honor him, because I know I'm standing on his shoulders, where if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be here today. So, and
look at what your dad did.
Yep.
He helped you to focus on the Lord. He did his job that Lord assigned to him to do. And so again, you could be focused, Brother Will, he's not there for me. It's like, no. Now my focus is on God. God sent him to my life for a purpose, and now that purpose is ended. Now God's got nothing. And maybe Brother Will's ministering to some other Uber passenger right now.
It might be another loud Filipino that he picked up from the club. Who knows?
I got to say, your Filipino accent's elite. That's elite. That's elite.
Hey, I appreciate that, man.
No, that's great, right? So what emotional pits have you found yourself in? Thank you, Lexon, for sharing that. And let's allow people space to share. And they may be going, I haven't had any, maybe prompted. What about from family or relationships, that have gone wrong? Because again, talking about it often brings a lot of space for healing. And then lastly, and this is probably the key takeaway, what might be keeping you from fixing your focus on the Lord in the middle of a relational challenge? How can we support one another in shifting our focus to God? I know many of us, or people in our small groups may be dealing with marriage challenges right now, right? And maybe the challenge to focus on God is, I'm just worried. What might happen? What happens if our marriage falls apart? Then where are the kids going to go? And you're just so focused on the worry that we're not focused on God. Or maybe it's you've got kids that are away in college now, and you're worried about them and what's going on with them, and that fear and the what ifs. You're so focused on that rather than being focused on God. And let's kind of process that. What are those challenges, and how can we fix our focus on the Lord? So again, whenever we have small group, pick the questions that best you think will best apply to your group. You know them the best. But I think the main takeaway is shifting our focus away from the people, the problems, the pit, and focusing on the Lord. I think if we can do that, we'll make a world of difference in one another's lives. And then lastly, of course, is pray that God will help us to overcome these things and fix our focus on God. And if there's any areas that we need healing, breakthrough, pray for those things, because God can work behind the scenes to bring transformation in our relationships. Amen. So again, this is so important, and thank you for leaning in your leadership in this time, because we really got to get ourselves relationally healthy.
Yes.
Because that's the best way that we can demonstrate the love of Jesus, is by the way that we love others. And so let's continue to shepherd one another in this way as we shift our relationships in a way that honors God. Thank you for all that you do. Yes. Thank you, Lexon, for sharing.
Thank you.
And have a great small group this week, and let's make a difference together. God bless you.